All right, well, thanks for having me here today to talk about reducing natural gas waste in the oil patch and looking at the problem of flaring and venting, why it occurs, and some things we can address from both a law and technology perspective to maybe mitigate that or lessen it. So waste of natural gas primarily originates when you've drilled for oil. So it's important to distinguish that you're not looking for natural gas. Wouldn't make any sense to be exploring for natural gas and then promptly to burn your product. So rather here, you're looking for oil, and when you drill for oil, you don't just get oil. In fact, you get usually oil, some gas, which is called casing head gas or associated gas, and water, as well as other things. The oil you truck away and sell into the market. The water is typically evaporated or injected. But what do you do with the gas? Ideally, in a perfect world, you would sell all of that gas. But often it's either not of a quality that can be sold into a market pipeline. It might be sulfurous. It might have a lot of nitrogen. It may not have value streams that necessarily can be captured. Or you may not have any way to get it to the market. And often that happens because drilling is happening in remote areas. North Dakota is a great example. It's the one I'll use most of today because when you look at flaring numbers by state, you don't see a lot of flaring in Texas. Why is that? It's not because there's not natural gas and casing head gas being produced with oil, but it's because you have 100 years of production history that has led to a very dense infrastructure of what we call takeaway capacity, which is the way to get gas to market. So you drill a well in Texas, you may have to build gathering lines or a pipeline, but you're only building them a few miles. If you drill new oil wells in the Bakken 10 years ago and there's never been production there, your nearest market pipeline could be hundreds of miles away, or your gas storage site. So what do you do with this gas? If you have small volumes, at least for the moment, you can vent it, which just means you let the uncombusted gas go straight into the atmosphere. This causes a number of problems because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 and other potential greenhouse gases. So the preferred method environmentally is flaring, and that is burning the natural gas that you can't sell, that you can't get out of your oil field, which converts it from methane and whatever else is in it into CO2, NOx, a number of other products. So this is ultimately, though, waste, right? It's a product that has value, that is of finite quantity, although I don't think I'll see the end of it in my lifetime or in my children's, but and you're burning it. It has commercial value that could be captured, which would benefit the owners of that product, and then it also has utility for electricity generation, for commercial use and domestic use. So ideally, we wouldn't have either flaring or venting, and the whole value stream could be captured. So you would think people would just say, well, let's have a no flare rule. Why are we wasting our valuable natural resources, particularly on public land, which is where a lot of this occurs? There are a number of different scenarios in which flaring is absolutely necessary. During production tests, well work, and emergencies, it can be necessary to prevent buildup of pressure. It's also permissible where gathering and selling it is either not possible or is not economic. The goal of this policy is if we required you to capture this gas and it changes the economics of your project so that you would then prematurely abandon your oil wells because of the cost of gathering, we don't want that, right? That creates an inefficient and irrational result. So we will allow you to flare gas from an oil well if it's not economically justified to capture it. So it is permissible to have this waste, but it's not desirable. And under new rules that have been recently proposed, it will also be costly. So where does waste typically come from? This is a North Dakota map or chart looking at it. So about 75% of oil well gas is being captured, but if you focus in on the blue and the orange, you'll see that the blue is flared gas from wells that have no sales. You can translate this to say there is no pipeline. But even more interesting is there's 16% as of 2014 that is flared gas from wells that have sold at least 1 MCF of gas. So there is takeaway capacity, but there's not enough. So you have a pipeline, you've invested, pardon, in the infrastructure, and yet it's insufficient. What that points to is lack of space usually in your market pipeline or your interstate pipeline. Even if you can get it out of your oil field, if you can't get it into a market pipeline because there's insufficient capacity, then you have to flare that gas. Particularly when you think that, looking at the Bakken, I think the nearest storage location that you can get to is in, for example, eastern Montana. So it's a long way. So it's not like you can just put it back in the ground and produce it later. So there's a number of different things that are trying to end waste through regulation. The new Quad A rules that have been put out by EPA are one of them. The venting and flaring and waste prevention rule from BLM is another. These are focused on, the BLM rule is focused on federal land or venting from federal land. And then something that's even more interesting is we're seeing this considered earlier in the process. So if you are applying for an oil and gas lease on federal land, the agencies through the NEPA process are now saying, well, we want to look at the eventual greenhouse gases that will be generated by this project if we approve it. And there's some guidance from CEQ that says we're going to use the federal social cost of carbon to do that. What that is it places a dollar amount per ton of CO2 emitted and says this is how we can quantify the global economic harm that we anticipate will result from emission of 1 additional ton of CO2. Recently, they've also developed a federal social cost of methane. Looking at the comparative estimates of harm from that, the SCC estimate, I believe right now, is about $33 per ton of CO2. Estimates for a ton of CH4 is more in the range of $500 to $3,000 per metric ton. And so if you think about that and you're starting to consider that in the analysis of whether or not you were going to issue a lease for example, a new oil field that will produce casing head and associated gas, that can sort of tilt the scales towards a decision that there will be a significant impact requiring mitigation or away from leasing. The venting and flaring rule also puts in some economic disincentives to flaring. Historically, you only had to pay royalty, which is the share of production that's given to the landowner on gas that was used or sold. Though now what this rule says is that we will treat gas that's flared in the course of normal operations as avoidably lost. And so we're going to subject that to a 12.5% royalty. This is important because you aren't selling that gas, so you're not getting any revenue, and yet you are paying the landowner, in this case the federal government, because it's a BLM rule, for the value of that gas at 12.5% of the market value. If this had been sold with no deductions for the cost of installing the infrastructure, what could you have gotten for it? And you're going to owe 12.5% of that. From a public policy standpoint, this somewhat makes sense, right? These are our public resources in natural gas. They are being depleted, and you don't get them back. So whether you're using them, you're selling them, or you're just burning them or venting them into the atmosphere, you never are going to realize anything from them again. So should we get royalty? Possibly. But again, that sort of tilts the scales economically for the economics of the oil project that you were initially developing. This is also happening on private land. We're seeing a lot more lawsuits from landowners who are saying that lease that requires that you pay me royalty, a cost-free share of production of everything produced from my land, that applies to flared and vented gas too. And these volumes aren't insignificant. Even at 260 an MCF, it adds up fairly quickly. Another thing is taxes. In order to try to cut back and limit flaring, a number of states are saying we are going to subject, after a reasonable period of time, flared gas to what are called production or severance taxes, which is the value stream that the state generates from the depletion of their natural resources. So they'll say, even though you're not selling it, we are going to charge our 7.5% or 8% severance tax on the value of that gas after some reasonable period. So these things kind of all combined together, I think, create a picture that flaring isn't a good idea. It's something that the industry has relied on, the ability to do, but I think that lease is running out. And if I had to bet on whether or not we would still be permitting flaring over the lifetime of a well, even 10 years from now, I'd say probably not. So where does this happen, and how big of a problem is it, and what can we do about it? This is also a 2014 graph. Sorry, EIA hasn't updated it, so I haven't been able to find a more recent one. But what you can see is that there's about, I'd say, maybe 10% or about 10 to 15% of the natural gas that's being produced is not being marketed. So that's being flared, that's value that could be captured, and it could be put to beneficial use. So why is that not happening? One thing that's interesting is if you go back to 2000, you can see that almost all of the natural gas is marketed. You go to 2007, all of the natural gas is marketed. And then very suddenly, you end up with this huge amount of natural gas that's not being marketed. And you can compare that and say, well, at the same time, the total amount of natural gas that's being produced has increased significantly. And this points to the fact that we can't create and build takeaway infrastructure to get the natural gas to market as fast as we can drill oil wells. I have a number of students who will usually say to me, well, why don't you build the pipeline before you drill the well? That would solve the problem. But it actually can't work that way, because if you imagine yourself as an oil producer, again, you're out there exploring for oil, not for natural gas, you don't know what you're going to find or if you're going to find anything. You could drill an oil well and it could be completely dry. That's happening less in shale plays as we've developed technology in that way. But even if you knew you were going to find something, you don't know how much associated gas there's going to be, whether it'll even be of a quality that can be marketed or that the purchaser would accept, and what kind of volumes you're going to be dealing with. So the idea that you would permit and build a natural gas pipeline away from your oil field before drilling those oil wells just wouldn't fit, because you can't plan for the infrastructure investments you will need to make until you have some scoping of the size of the problem and that you need to address with that infrastructure. That's not to say, though, that we couldn't do a much better job. Right now, building takeaway capacity is extraordinarily costly and time-consuming. One of the places where I think we can do the most to streamline that is in the process, in the stage of getting right-of-way and easements for gathering facilities. So one way to imagine this is almost like the circulatory system of the human body, where you start with gathering lines, which are the finest sort of system. They move into trunk lines, which are bigger, which then move into market pipelines, which are like your aorta, right? So you start with tiny pipelines that just gather from one well. They move into larger lines that gather all of those tiny pipelines together, which then eventually end up in a large pipeline that takes it to a point of sale. At every stage, you're compressing gas. You have to keep it under pressure to keep it moving. You have to, before you can usually put it in pipelines, dehydrate it, separate it out from the oil. So there's a lot of steps in this process. One misconception is that you can just build gathering lines under the idea that you have the right to use the surface to drill for oil, and that should include the right to build pipelines. But it's a common misconception that you can build anything you want on the surface when you have a drilling lease. Rather, that implied easement to use the surface is limited only to construction and operations that benefit the minerals directly underneath that parcel. So if I have 2 wells on 2 leases that are, for example, in 40-acre spacing, and I want to build one pipeline to take the gas from those 2 wells away, the landowner can say to me, no, you can only use my surface for my gas. You cannot use it to benefit my neighbor's gas unless you obtain an easement from me and pay me additional consideration. So the idea that you can just build it without talking to the landowner, that just doesn't fly. So what you usually need is ideally easements and right-of-way that are obtained through negotiations with the landowner. But there's not eminent domain in most states for gathering lines. There is for the market pipelines, but not for gathering. There's been some recent cases in Pennsylvania and Colorado that have looked at this expressly under the condemnation statutes and said, no, we are not going to allow use of eminent domain for gathering facilities. So you have to build it. You're going to have to go out and negotiate individually with each landowner and purchase those easements. That's costly. And additionally, then you have to get a permit to construct them. And so we usually see this taking at least 8 months, but sometimes several years. And the problem this creates is over that period, pardon, your well is in its steepest portion of decline. And so by the time you can actually build the infrastructure, right, you can't build it before you drill. And then if you have to wait 8 months to 2 years after you drill to build the infrastructure, you've also already used most of that gas by flaring and venting because the wells declined and depleted over that period. These wells, especially in the shales plays, are producing very quickly. They come on hard and they burn out fast. So looking here, you can see that about 70% of the Three Forks and 71% of production in the Bakken depletes or declines after the first year. So if it takes 1 year to then drill, after drilling to build your pipeline, all of the gas that's sort of under this portion of the curve in the first year has been flared or vented. And so you're only looking at building infrastructure to capture the tail of that curve. So even with streamlined regulation, you're going to have some venting and flaring. If we could get that down to 6 months, it would reduce venting and flaring a lot. You'd be getting a lot more gas into market. New Mexico has a great example of a gathering line acquisition statute that does allow eminent domain for gathering lines and provides metrics for calculating compensation of that. Wyoming allows it under its general public use in eminent domain statute as well. And you see less flaring as a result in those states. So what are you going to do, though, with that first 5 or 6 months? Because even just the construction process would take that long if you take out permitting. One of the things we're looking at is on-site gas utilization. Can we use this where it's being produced out of the ground, right? We're going to say, we know we don't have pipelines. We know we don't have gathering lines, at least not yet. So what can we do with this volume of gas where it's at, when it's being produced? There's been a huge amount of innovation in this field, even in like the last 5 years. A number of things. On-site electrical generation is a big one. Oil fields are very energy intensive, and electricity is one of the highest expenses of oil producers. So if you can generate your own electricity to run your rigs, to run your pumps, and other equipment, rather than buying that off of the grid or using a diesel generator, that's preferable. And you're using something that would otherwise be wasted. Fertilizer production from wellhead natural gas has also come up. Conversion of natural gas to liquid fuel, so looking at on-site, basically mini LNG plants. And then small-scale processing of the natural gas on-site. Both of those would basically allow it to be trucked. So we're looking at solutions that say we're going to turn it into a marketable product and truck it off-site, or we're going to burn it on-site, but instead of just burning it for flaring, why don't we burn it in a way that is not wasteful, that puts it to productive use? I wanted to note that a number of these options, particularly conversion to LNG, are not commercial in any sense, which is why you don't see more of it. It makes a lot more sense just to burn it than to try to do something like that when you look at natural gas prices where they're at today, even for liquid natural gas. So kind of the big point here is this is going to continue to be a problem. Even if we could harmonize technology and regulation, you're not going to get to a no-flare standard. But you could also do a lot to get us closer, where we're wasting less and making more off of this previously sort of ignored value stream. So we don't know where it's going to be is important, right? Right now, we're looking at the Permian, the Niobrara, the Bakken, but the next oil field is going to be somewhere else. If you'd said to people that you'd be producing in Dallas 20 years ago, they would have thought that you were crazy. If you said you were going to be producing in North Dakota 15 years ago, they'd say you were crazy. So where we'll be producing next, we don't know. And so we have to put in place the regulatory infrastructure, and we have to focus on the technology, the technological innovations that are needed so that when the next oil and gas boom occurs, we're ready to respond. And we won't see the huge volumes of gas vented and flared that we've seen in the past. That's important from a climate perspective. It's important from a public policy perspective, and it's important because these are finite resources that we should be putting to good use. How do we do that? I see opportunities for streamlining the land process of obtaining right away to make it easier to build pipelines and easements. Streamlining permitting processes is another thing, particularly on federal lands where you have to go through a NEPA analysis. This can be very arduous and time-consuming to do. We've also seen a lot of public opposition to these pipelines in recent years, and so building a social license over this period until that next boom so that there's support and consensus of the public that this is valuable and necessary, I think is important. And then the other thing is continuing to innovate in the space of on-site utilization. So during that first year when you're building takeaway capacity, that gas isn't being wasted through flaring and venting, but is rather being put to productive use. So Greyson, I think, is going to speak to the economics of on-site generation and how that can be utilized as a way to reduce flaring and venting, both domestically and with more global implications as well. If you have any questions, then we can take them together afterwards. So thanks.
you know how to start up the Prezi? Spot 929. Okay, there we go. Okay, so my name is Greyson Buckingham. I'm the Director of Policy for Mesa Natural Gas Solutions. So a little bit about Mesa Natural Gas Solutions. It's a T. Boone Pickens held company, and we are the largest provider in the world for natural gas generators, particularly used for on-site power generation in the oil and gas fields throughout the United States and throughout the world. Currently, we operate in the major basins throughout the United States, in particular Texas, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Oklahoma. So great segue from Terra. What we seek to do is take associated gas and convert that into electricity. So one of our main phrases is turning a waste product into an asset. And so when you drill for a typical oil and gas well, three things come out: oil, gas, and water. As Tara mentioned, when most producers are developing those assets, they're seeking out oil. So that gas, it's extremely expensive to build out pipelines for that time period. So what do they do with that? They generally flare it or they vent it. And that's not being put to any beneficial use. It's emitting tremendous amounts of different pollutants into the air. And it's electricity that you and I as citizens of the United States aren't obtaining the benefit for. And so right now in the oil and gas industry, there's three major types of provisions of electricity. There are diesel generators, which we'll get into and look at those emissions profiles, which in throughout the world represent around 75% of on-site power generation. However, in the United States, what we've seen is nobody is using diesel generators from here on out, based primarily on economics and secondarily on the fact that new regulations coming from the EPA and BLM have made natural gas generators much more favorable. But 99.9% of the wells throughout the United States, and there's over 2 million wells, are powered by the grid. But one of the downsides of transmission through grid are not only the costs, but the fact that if you have distribution lines out to an oil and gas site, well, and there's no pipeline to that site, what are we doing with all that gas? It's being flared. So natural gas generators are a great way to capture that gas and to reduce flaring, because the methane emissions after natural gas is placed through a natural gas generator are effectively zero. As we see, most of the world's sites are in remote areas, and throughout the world, diesel generators are primarily the main source for on-site power generation at 75%, like I said, but that's decreasing throughout the United States. And so what Mesa Natural Gas Solutions has done is about 5 years ago, we actually started off as our sister company, Moser Energy Systems, manufactured diesel generators, and they've been in the business for over 40 years. And once we saw the potential of natural gas based on the economics and the environmental impact, we now exclusively lease natural gas generators. And it's very difficult because what we're looking at is wellhead natural gas. So it's not pipeline quality gas, which is typically around 1150 BTU. So these engines are able to capture gas from a BTU range of anywhere from 600 to 2,500 BTUs. And so this innovative technology has allowed for multiple beneficial implications. So they run on wellhead natural gas, and if the PSI at the well is not high enough, or there's not enough natural gas coming from that wellhead, they're able to switch over to propane as a backup. We offer a 95% runtime guarantee. This is one of our techs, so every single employee as well at Mesa has to build a generator before they can start work at the company, so they understand everything. So I had to build a generator. Megan is one of our sales engineers. From the secretaries to the CEO, we've all built generators so we can better understand our product. And the neat thing about these as well is that we have geolocation and engine status. So we're able to pull up an app that shows where all of our generators are throughout the world. And I could click on, I pull up an app and this generator's here in Mexico. It'll give me over 3,225 different diagnostic trouble codes, so I can run data and check on the status of this, which allows us to better track emissions as well. So these are some common preconceptions regarding natural gas generators. First, that they're not a long-term solution. We typically see lease times of about 8 months. So what happens is when you're out in a remote location, you need that on-site power generation immediately to develop that asset. So those pump jacks, those ESPs, all those compressors, they need electricity, and it takes a while to get those easement rights and to build out distribution lines to a site. So they use a natural gas generator with the idea that line power is cheaper. So once that comes, they'll kick off the natural gas generator. So it's a preconception of not being a long-term power need. The fact that it's unable to meet complex power needs. And when this technology first started off about 5 years ago, there were some disreputable vendors that made it less, that kind of left a bad taste in some of the operators' mouths. So from Mesa's competitive positioning, like I mentioned, these units run off of a wide range of BTU content. There's no associated royalty. So as Tara mentioned with that BLM rule, when there's a 12.5% minimum royalty imposed on all gas that's flared on federal lands, if you use that natural gas for on-site power generation, you don't pay any royalty on that. All these units come EPA certified. They're subject to 40 CFR Part 60 Quad J. And we pay a premium for that, and they're able to meet these complex power needs. So the smallest unit is at 75 kilowatts, and our largest one is at 1.3 megawatts, but what these units have are parallel capability, so we could effectively meet any power need possible by being able to hook up generators. So if you needed 80 megawatts, for example, all of those generators would talk to one another to meet those power needs. And we have units that are 9,000 feet high in Colorado, in the Buckingham, where it's negative 40 degrees, and we've had no issues with climate or other weather constraints. And before we entered this industry, the common standard was to have all these natural gas generators just on the skid. And we said, well, why don't we put that on a trailer so that we can move them from site to site? And so now they're all trailer mounted and self-contained so that they can be moved easily. And really the only cost you're looking at, you have an upfront cost to install the generator, so you'll have an electrician come out and make sure that everything at that site is, so you can utilize those natural gas generators to receive gas and then to provide electricity. And then they're typically leased on a monthly rate, although sometimes they're also leased by kilowatt. So why have natural gas generators become a primary technology for providing power in the United States? Two main reasons: economics and environmental regulations. So if we look at this is the average retail price of electricity in the United States. It's nearly doubled in the last decade. And so these are the major states where we're helping to develop oil and gas assets. The price of electricity is going to continue to rise. So there's three major tariffs for utility consumers. You have the residential tariff, which is what we all pay at our homes. You have the commercial tariff, which is what the Whitmore would be subject to on a utility rate. And then the industrial tariff, and that's what these oil and gas operators are paying. And those industrial tariffs continue to rise throughout the entire United States. And when we look at a comparison between diesel generators and natural gas generators, well, diesel, you have to pay for fuel. Natural gas generators have fuels coming out of the ground. You don't pay anything for that, and it's not subject to any royalties. So if we take this example with a 22-liter natural gas engine, which provides 350 kilowatts at full load, and we look at the amount of diesel, pricing it at $2.50, on a year, you save $334,000 per unit by not using that diesel fuel. So just by a primarily economic standpoint, it's much more efficient to use natural gas generators because you're not paying any fuel costs. And there's a lot of other benefits as well. And then when we look at the different regulations, so the EPO Quad OA, the Obama administration is seeking to reduce methane and volatile organic compound emissions by 45%. And in these regulations, they provide for a 4-step process. But one of those is reduced emissions completions. And so if you use natural gas generators before you're flaring or combusting that natural gas, you qualify as a reduced emission completion, which allows those operators to be in compliance with those new rules. So it's a way that it's economically beneficial for these operators, at the same time allowing them to continue to develop those assets. And then, as Tara mentioned as well, the BLM flaring rule, there's a minimum 12.5% royalty on flared vented gas, but if you use that natural gas for on-site power generation, you're not subject to that royalty. And then we see different state regulations that put a cap on the amount of natural gas you're allowed to flare. So in Wyoming, for example, you have to get a permit for any well that flares more than 60,000 cubic feet a day in natural gas. Well, that 22-liter in that last example consumes 55,000 cubic feet a day of natural gas at 50% load. So if you're flaring 100 MCF a day at that well and you're using a 22-liter that's consuming 55 MCF a day, well, you're able to bring down your flaring levels to allow you to be in compliance with those state regulations, while at the same time generating electricity from that natural gas and putting it to a beneficial use. So as a comparison with diesel, natural gas generators emit approximately 99% less emissions. So if we take that 350 kilowatt unit at full load, you'll see the NOx levels, 49 tons per year is going to be reduced by using a natural gas generator compared to a diesel generator. And then the carbon monoxide levels are 10 tons per year reduced. Volatile organic compounds, 3.67 tons per year reduced. And another thing that it does as well is it reduces that impact on the landowners, because for diesel generators, you're seeing people have to refuel every 3 to 5 days those units. Well, natural gas generators, you don't have those. You don't need that fueling, so you don't have people going out to the sites every week to fuel it. And so in a practical example, you can see how that plays out. One of our customers in Texas, they replaced 393 of their diesel generators with the natural gas generators. So in 1 year, they realized fuel savings of $67 million by not having to pay for diesel fuel. You could see there was, in nitrous oxide, approximately 5,600 tons per year reduced, CO 1,100 tons, and VOC 420. And then there was also approximately 17,500 less truck deliveries from people having to go and fuel diesel. And you know, those implications are huge. And with these emissions in total, it was equivalent to taking 9,000 vehicles off of the road, and almost 2.8 billion cubic feet of natural gas captured that was generating electricity that otherwise would have been flared and would not have been put to beneficial use for society. And we're doing this all throughout the world. So that was a comparison with diesel generators. The other thing, like I mentioned, is with those 2 million wells plus in the United States, 99.9% of them are electrified by distribution lines, so from the grid in different utility companies. But if you look at the line items, and what happens with oil and gas operators is that they treat capital expenditures and operating expenditures differently. So for those CapEx, the cost center is typically an entire field or a country. So that production foreman who's responsible for electrifying a site, which is typically the second or third highest cost for an oil and gas operator, is only concerned with those operating costs, so what his monthly utility bill is. And he doesn't have to factor in those capital expenditures, which means building out distribution lines to those sites. So when you have the grid, right, you've got transmission lines and then you have distribution lines. Well, to connect to those transmission lines, those oil and gas operators have to physically pay themselves to build out that distribution line infrastructure to provide electricity to their wells. And so they don't factor in that CapEx a lot of times. So when you look at these different line items, they're paying for a primary meter trunk line to be developed, air switchers and reclosers, site distribution extensions and transformers. The list goes on and on. Grid studies, which can prove to be extremely expensive. And they pay for the ongoing maintenance, they pay for right-of-ways, and then they also have to replace old and damaged equipment. But when you look at a natural gas generator line item, you're just paying that lease rate, either the monthly rate or by the kilowatt hour. So we worked with the University of Wyoming to conduct a study because no one's done this before. So what are oil and gas operators paying to electrify the oil field? Let's look at those capital expenditures and those operating costs. So on the CapEx analysis in these 5 states, and we also included North Dakota, which isn't represented here, we're looking at anywhere from $50,000 to $85,000 per mile. So if you've got a site that's 10 miles, multiply that by 10, that's what you're paying in these different states. Now, when you look at the different operating costs, and we assessed on the county level over 96 different counties in 6 states, what are you paying per kilowatt hour? And so typically you've got 3 different charges on your utility bill. You've got a fixed charge, that's what you're going to pay every month no matter what. You've got the average demand charge, which is typically the most amount of power that site needed within a 12-month period, and then you multiply that kilowatt demand by these rates, and then you've got your average energy price, which is how much you actually consume throughout that month. So, we're looking at Colorado, the range is significant. You've got anywhere from 6 cents to 16 cents per kilowatt hour. Wyoming, 4 cents to 1.3. And you'll see Texas is extremely low on that low end at 3.5 cents. And that's because of ERCOT and the competitive pricings where all these other prices are set by the public commissions. And for natural gas generators, typically you need to be at around 6 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour to be competitive. So if we can meet those ranges, then we can compete with them on an operating expense level. So this is an example in the Permian, which out of all the basins we analyze is the most difficult one to compete with because the land is extremely flat, so those CapEx costs are going to be lower. And the Permian also has a great utility infrastructure since it's been developing oil and gas plays for over approximately 100 years. So we chose the most difficult one to analyze. So what we're looking at here, we're using Encore electric delivery rates. We're looking at a 5-mile primary trunk line, which means that it takes 5 miles of distribution lines to connect to the transmission grid. And we took a scenario with 15 wells and then a scenario with 50 wells. So if you're using grid power all in, for the lifetime of that well, because we took the production decline rates. So as Tara was mentioning, that first year production is ripping, and then typically we saw it's around 12 to 15 years that a well will be able to have those steady rates. So we're looking at the entire lifetime. For 15 wells, the operator is going to pay $2.9 million approximately. For 50, $9.7 million. And then you can see the kilowatt hour breakdown as well. So we're looking at 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, in 2014, when oil was at above $100 per barrel, we were able to set our prices extremely high and enjoy great profit margins. Right now, since oil is operating around $45 per barrel, we had to reduce our prices by approximately 50%. But what's been so great about that is we're still able to generate a profit. We were the second fastest growing company in Wyoming last year. We continue to hire employees every single week. But by lowering our prices, we were able to see, wow, we can actually compete with the utility company, which opens up the market to those 2 million plus wells throughout the United States. And so by lowering our prices, you can see our low prices, we're at 5 cents per kilowatt hour. We're in our mid prices, we were at 8 cents. And we want to stay at these levels so that we're able to capture more flared gas and to compete with the utilities. And so, you see here the all-in cost is $2.47 million for the 15 wells, and for 50 wells, it's 9.36. So, you're saving a significant chunk of change for these operators. So, on this chart, it basically shows the CapEx costs plus the operating costs, but on those mid to low, so the green is on our low prices, we're beating on the kilowatt hour those utility companies. And this is with the 15 wells, it's even more significant. So here is a model, and actually since now, we've actually ran over 600,000 different scenarios that could play out in all these different counties, factoring in those capital expenditures and operating costs with the University of Wyoming. Natural gas generators at our current mid to low prices beat out utility power almost 90% of the time when you're developing new green fields. And so not only does this save oil and gas operators money, but when you have distribution lines, you can't capture that flared gas. What natural gas generators allow for is for that gas to be properly generated into electricity to be placed into a beneficial use. So what's also neat about this is the potential to sell excess power back to the grid. So a lot of these developments, what we looked at, we're looking at green fields. So there isn't already a utility infrastructure in place. They say, okay, we're going to develop, these 20 square miles. We'll start building out utility lines to provide power to these new wells being developed. But so what about fields that already have distribution lines, but that are still flaring natural gas? Well, according to the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, if you're registered as a qualifying facility, which is anything below 80 megawatts, which typically we see is for wind farms and solar farms, those utility companies are required to purchase electricity from a qualifying facility. Well, waste, according to PURPA, natural gas that would otherwise be flared, that's not placed into a marketable condition, qualifies as waste, which qualifies as a renewable fuel source, which if it powers a qualifying facility, then those utility companies are required by federal law to purchase that electricity at an avoided cost or negotiated price, which we see is normally around 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour, but in some places it's much higher than that. So what can we do if you're flaring gas? So let's say, and we'll look at, these are our different units and how much gas can be flared. So you see 55 MCF a day. 115 MCF is what we typically see in North Dakota being flared per day at a well site. So let's take our 350 kilowatt unit, for example. If that site is flaring 115 MCF a day, they only need, so at 50% load, that amount of power. What do we do with the other 60 MCF a day that's still being flared? And if there's distribution lines already to that site, well, we'll put a second unit on there, generate that into electricity. Instead of receiving power to that site, we're actually sending it back to the grid, and then we'll be able to develop, approximately 200 more kilowatts worth of power and place it back into the grid while still capturing 100% of that gas that's being flared, powering that site, and then giving you, the end consumers, more electricity from those assets that aren't being properly utilized. And so with PURPA, obviously you've got different obstacles. So natural gas generators, if they're on the site for more than 12 months, you need to get a stationary permit. But those have been pretty easy to obtain in the past. One major obstacle is an interconnection cost. So to place electricity back onto the grid, you have to conduct a grid study, which can cost anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000. So depending on the economics, that might inhibit conducting a project of that magnitude. But what's neat about this is there's a technology here today that can eliminate flared gas immediately in an economical way. And so that's what we're seeking to do as a company. And so, these opportunities are immense. The United States right now is number 5 regarding countries that flare and vent natural gas, and this is taken from the World Bank. You can see Russia is flaring over 50 billion cubic meters a year, and Nigeria is number 2 at approximately 15 billion cubic meters a year. What we want to do is set up different microgrids, place electricity back onto the grid while providing those oil and gas operators with electricity. So let's take Nigeria, for example. 75% of the population in Nigeria doesn't have reliable electricity. But Nigeria, like I mentioned, flares the second most amount of natural gas in the entire world. If we used our technology to capture all the gas they flared, we'd be able to provide 164% of that country's power needs. So when you have a population where 75% of the population doesn't have electricity, yet you're flaring that much amount of gas where we could meet 164% of their power needs, we're trying to look to solutions where we can take that gas and provide electricity to that country and even export it based on the amount of natural gas that's being flared there. So we have different challenges. Right now, as I mentioned, 40 CFR Part 60 Quad J regulates natural gas generators, while 40 CFR Part 60 Quad I regulates diesel generators, and the emission levels are actually more lenient, and sometimes by 10 for diesel generators because their nitrous oxide emissions are extremely high. So we'd like to see a level playing field that regulates those emissions at the same levels for grams per horsepower hour. And then different policies that discourage electricity being generated from excess gas to be placed onto the grid. No one has done this before, so it's a new territory, but it'd be nice to have different policies in place that say, okay, flaring and venting of natural gas is an issue. There's a technology that allows it to be generated into electricity and placed onto the grid. Let's encourage that in the meantime to use these existing infrastructure that's put in place, or even build out distribution lines to capture 100% of that flared and vented gas, generate into electricity, and place it onto the grid. And we're working on that as a company for more favorable policies, particularly with FERC, but a lot of that's regulated by those public service commissions as well on the state level. And then obviously there's status quo bias. People say, well, I've always used diesel generators, or I've always built out line power. And even after we show them these studies where 90% of the cases at these low prices, it's more economical to use a natural gas generator for the lifetime of the well, they're like, well, we've always done it that way. We don't want to change. So a lot of it's just educating people on the economic and environmental benefits of using this type of technology. And as I mentioned before, those preconceptions earlier, since this technology is relatively new about pricing, reliability, experience, and service. So just dealing with those misconceptions and educating people on these benefits. So with that said, if there's any questions, Tara and I would be happy to take them and discuss further. Yeah.
So it seems like EPA regulations, has really kind of incentivized this market to kind of work on just improving how we're doing business. Do you anticipate the new administration, a setback, I guess, or what if the 12.5% royalty is no longer required? Do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like things could change, that there's no longer a reason to want to.
Well, luckily, so we have the regulatory case, but the main business proposition is that the economics are, it's now better to use natural gas generators. So these are better to obviously help stay in compliance with BLM and EPA rules and different state rules as well. Like in Wyoming, for example, it took to apply for a permit to use a natural gas generator on a well site anywhere from 90 to 120 days. And then every year you had to do a performance test that cost $5,000 per generator. So if you're an operator and you have 100 generators, you're paying $500,000 to do these tests, where, like I mentioned, we have diagnostic trouble codes where we can track emissions essentially. And our emissions are typically around 90% below the permitted threshold, and none of our engines have ever been out of compliance. We're like, why do operators have to pay $500,000 every single year and wait 90 to 120 days when diesel generators don't do that? So we were able to effectively change those regulations. So now that we can streamline natural gas generators, but to more effectively answer your question, no, it doesn't matter. The environmental laws help us out, and we'd like to see even more incentives to develop this technology, but it comes down to a strictly economic case. And right now, as I mentioned, in the world, approximately 75% of on-site power generation is through diesel, not natural gas. But in the United States, no one is using new diesel generators. They're using those for existing wells, but all the new wells that are coming online are using natural gas generators.
Regardless of the
regardless of the regulatory environment.
Yeah. Has Alberta taken up this technology in a big way?
Yeah, so Canada, with its new administration, recently just adopted all of the EPA.
Trudeau's government doesn't have authority over energy use within provinces. So you're really talking about
Calgary is
province by province.
Yeah,
and Alberta is the keystone.
Right. Yeah. So with Calgary, they are using pretty much similar to the EPA regulations. I mean, I actually even learned last night they have to have CSA standards for all of our engines, so now we have to go back and apply that for Canada. But yes, the regulatory framework from what we've done throughout Calgary is similar to the United States.
Alberta is much bigger than Calgary.
Right.
You've got an interesting political situation there as well, because you have a new Democrat government that is committed to sustainability, but an oil and gas industry that can't change overnight. They've reduced the number of significant flaring sources from thousands to basically hundreds right now, and they're very interested in moving towards sustainability. But there's the legacy oil and gas industry. So it would seem to me that this would be a perfect demonstration project. They also have a regulatory regime that was modeled after Texas.
Yeah, and that's things we're looking into.
Texas was modeled after Alberta, but that was like at the beginning of the last century.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry I got here a little late, but are you doing any smart communities? Are you integrating what your generators are within the overall ecosystem of a smart community anywhere?
We have some of that in North Dakota at a reservation, and we're actually looking to do that more, particularly on different reservations where they can provide power completely in-house.
Okay.
When they're producing oil and gas wells.
So I work with the Loudoun County Gramercy Sustainable Smart Community right here in Loudoun County.
Okay.
It's been the largest innovation hub. So our whole goal is just to promote innovation in ecosystems and try to encourage integration, because a lot of people sell products and brokers, but where do we have a whole thing integrated into an ecosystem, water, power, shelter, and then they can actually build in place is where we're going. So actually around the world, people can build in place sustainable smart communities. Awesome. So we have kits. Uganda's #1 refugee resettlement country in the world because they give all the refugees kits to build their own shelter. Well, why can't we give them kits to produce their own water, produce their own food? You know what I'm saying? It gets this thing where we can really help. So yeah, I like your cards in motion.
Yeah, absolutely. The one tough thing about this is you have to have access to natural gas, right?
Right.
And then we do have propane as a backup, but when you take the economics of propane and compare it to diesel, normally diesel is more economical.
Yeah, the Horman district has a lot of natural gas.
Which makes these, that's awesome for those types of projects.
What about landfills?
So we are looking at pyrolysis projects as well. Like I said, the BTU content of this gas is anywhere from 600 to 2,500 BTU.
Oh, pyrolysis is different from landfill methane generation.
Yeah, no, from the waste. Are you referring to the waste that would be coming off of those landfills? Yeah. So we are looking at that. Like I said, the BTU is anywhere from 600 to 2,500. Our units can operate off of that. We haven't done any landfill projects, but these are things we're looking into. 99% of our revenue comes from oil and gas applications, but we do want to start expanding into other market opportunities.
So technologically, I'm wondering, obviously you guys are testing this. There's a lot of impurities, like you were mentioning, that are coming out. So how do you handle the level of it? Is there a pre-processing of the natural gas, which would be before flaring that are going in, or how do you adapt to that changing?
No, well, that's what makes this technology so powerful, is that it just runs straight off of wellhead natural gas. So it comes straight out of the wellhead, and then we have H2S filters as well. So if there's too much H2S that goes through the unit, well, that's not a good thing. But there's scrubbers that make sure that that H2S is separated before it's placed into the generator.
The H2S content is one of the major reasons why fluorine was used in the past.
I think also something that I sort of occurred to me during Greyson's presentation and I wanted to emphasize is that this really addresses the waste issue. Generation from natural gas on-site generation can be more efficient and better burning and combustion, but it's not emissions free. So it certainly is better than venting, but just as flaring has emissions, so does natural gas generation. So it really is attacking it from the waste angle. Why are we putting something that has commercial value and can be utilized to waste when we don't have to? Well, thank you. There's no more questions. Thanks so much.